much for joining. Puneetji, thanks for joining. Navroz, thanks for joining.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar launch of the report, a model-based assessment of variable renewable grid integration costs in India, which seeks to address the drivers of grid integration costs for VRE that are likely to be most substantial in the Indian context. I would like to invite Dr. Ajay Mathur, Director General of the Energy and Resources Institute, to deliver his opening remarks.
A very good afternoon to all of you. I am delighted that we have this illustrious group of people with us, both on the panel and as participants. As we have gone ahead over the past, actually a year, we have been seeing that more and more variable renewable energy is being added to the grid. Like many others, we were concerned about the stability of the grid and therefore started a process of modeling on how the grid would behave with larger amounts of renewable energy and what would it take for this grid to be stable. Our colleague, Mr. Thomas Spencer, led this effort. He would be in a few minutes sharing the way we went about doing this, and came up with the, well, maybe I shouldn't give the spoiler right in the beginning. But before that, let me thank the various colleagues, because bringing this kind of information into discussion, I think, is important as we look at adding more and more renewables into the grid. I particularly thank Mr. Pujari for being with us and for so kindly agreeing to release this report. When we looked at it, we thought that it is important that as a grid management concern, as a grid stability security concern, this is something that needs a broader amount of discussion. We also hope that this encourages other institutions to also address this issue and possibly use other methodologies as well. Because without having a robust structure, a robust agreement, a robust way of looking at interventions, we will not be able to move ahead with a strategy that in the longer term promises a better future for all of us, better both in terms of the kinds of energy that we get, less carbon intensive, of course, but also one that is overall cost effective for the Indian consumer. So without further ado, let me welcome all of you again, and we look forward to this discussion.
Thank you, sir. I'd now like to invite Dr. Mathur and Shri Pujari, who is the chairman of the Central Electricity Regulatory Commission, to launch the report.
Okay.
How do you do?
So yeah. So so you need to touch the screen. Yes.
Okay.
Press the cursor, and it will launch the report.
Yeah, I tried it. I'm trying. Yeah.
There it goes. There it goes. So, sir, thank you very much for this process. We do realize that it is not as good as a personalized process, but thank you very much, sir. So can I request you to share your thoughts with us? I know that you have to leave early because you have got another meeting which is actually waiting for you. But again, let me thank you in advance.
Thank you, Dr. Mathur. And it's nice to see all of you. And this pandemic has basically made us quite accustomed to all the virtual meetings and discussions. So I think it's become a new normal, and I think everybody is comfortable with that. So there's no issue on that. Having said so, I'm also extremely delighted to be part of this today's event of release of the report, model-based assessment of variable renewable grid integration cost in India. I consider the report to be an extremely important one in the context of transformation that the Indian power sector is undergoing at the present, and the structure that the sector would have in near future. The report couldn't have been prepared at a more appropriate time. So I congratulate TERI and the team of TERI who have done this research and come out with the report. Concerns for climate change and one of the lowest electricity prices discovered in the recent wind and solar auctions have created the possibility for greater share of RE in the generation mix in the Indian power system in coming time. While that is the undisputed common objective of having larger share of RE in the generation mix, and that is also as per our commitment that we have given in the international fora, the consequential challenges that emerge due to the inherently variable nature of such solar and wind resources need to be addressed. The challenges relating to the real-time balancing of supply and demand would only increase with an increasing share of RE in the generation mix. The challenges have two aspects. One is the operational and technical, and second is the cost. My understanding is that the operational and technical challenges are a matter of research and development, and I'm sure our engineers are capable of addressing them, and a lot of work has been done on that. However, while the price of RE can continue to fall, the cost of integration will play a key role in determining how fast will be the penetration of such RE resources in the Indian power system. So in this context, the present report, based on the simulated studies under various scenarios, gains significance. The need for an analysis of the cost of integration of VRE in the Indian context was never so deeply required. In the report that I have gone through, the grid integration cost of the VRE has been broken down into three categories: transmission, balancing, and profile cost. And their behavior have been analyzed under various alternative scenarios to explore the drivers of grid integration cost of VRE. The analysis has brought out several interesting conclusions, but some of the conclusions which I consider key are, Dr. Mathur said that he will not be the spoiler, but I think I need to highlight one or two key conclusions because it has, I understand it has great implications. The first one is that it shows that the optimal VRE penetration is determined by the trade-off between the variable cost savings and per unit increase in the fixed cost. That's one part of it, very interesting. Second is that the possible opportunities for variable cost arbitrage can enable VRE shares of 40%, even accounting for the impact of sunk cost in the existing system. That's one. And as the energy cost of storage is expected to fall, VRE is expected to meet the subsequent incremental demand growth. These conclusions from the study have huge policy implications, and I'm sure that these will be factored in by the appropriate authority when they formulate the policy and lay down the future path. I mean, we have a target. We have a target for 2030 and for RE generation, but a lot of works need to be done simultaneously along the way to make sure that this integration takes place smoothly, and the issues that arise gets challenged. So having said so, I think I like to take this opportunity to again congratulate the authors for undertaking the study and preparing the report, and TERI for supporting the study on such an important subject, which is large, as I understand, has large policy implications. And I'm sure, as Dr. Mathur has said, that probably this will trigger other studies and any other point of view, and these issues will become more and more, it is already real, but more and more real as we go along. And so my best wishes at this moment to all of you, TERI and Dr. Mathur in particular. And we spoke telephonically, but of course now we are seeing each other virtually. And thank you for inviting me and then sharing my, permitting me to share my little thoughts. Thank you so much, Dr. Mathur.
Thank you very much, sir. I can't tell you how good I feel to have this report released by you. It had long been an ambition of mine that we provide something which can be of policy use to you at the Commission. Thank you very much, sir, for finding the time to release this report.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for sharing your insights. I would now like to request the lead author of the report, Mr. Thomas Spencer, Fellow TERI, for making his presentation on the.
Thank you very much, Avni. Just confirming that my screen is visible and that I am audible okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So let me thank Dr. Mathur for opening the webinar, Mr. P.K. Pujari for launching the report, and all of our panelists for joining us today. I think it is a very important conversation that we are to have today, and I'm very much looking forward to it. So I will briefly present the key findings of this study. So the main motivation for the study is, as was previously mentioned, we have seen auction results in India that are very clear that renewables are now providing the cheapest source of electricity, not just compared to other sources, but really across the history of the electricity system. Electricity has never been available as cheaply as it is today from variable renewables. However, we know that renewables introduce other costs into the system, so-called grid integration costs, and that these costs have not yet been properly studied in the Indian contexts. We have had a lot of analysis of the technical aspects of how we balance the system under high shares of renewables, but we have not had such detailed analysis of the economic aspects of how high shares of renewables may impact on the total system cost of the power system. And this is particularly important in today's context of financial stress of discoms as a result of the COVID-19 shock, financial stress then percolating back onto the generating companies and so on. So we felt it was very important to bring out an analysis of what determines these grid integration costs, how significant they are, and what they mean in terms of whether we can continue to ramp up renewables at the rate that we are planning to do. So key question, what are grid integration costs? So Mr. Pujari very kindly broke them down for us in the 3 categories that we also use in the report. The first category is transmission costs. So sources of power are not co-located with sources of demand, and you need to build transmission infrastructure to bring electricity to demand. That creates broader costs which need to be paid not by generators, but more broadly across the rest of the electricity system. We also have balancing costs. The balancing costs refer to the costs of compensating for the random or stochastic variability of renewables. So by stochastic, we mean that even if forecasting is brought up to the state-of-the-art level, there is still a degree of randomness in the short-term variability of renewables. You know, a cloud may cross the sun for half an hour that was not in the forecast. The wind may suddenly drop for half an hour that was not in the forecast. And having enough capacity, enough flexible capacity online to compensate for these short-term variations is known as balancing costs. We then have this issue of profile costs. So profile costs are costs that would still exist even if RE could be perfectly forecast. So for example, we know that the sun doesn't shine after the sun sets, and therefore solar energy is not producing. That can be forecast with perfect certitude. But given this, we need to have other resources available online to generate when renewables are not generating. And their additional cost to the system is what we call profile costs. So you can also think of these as backup costs, the cost of the backup capacity, which is online and can generate when renewables are not available. A key point that I would like to make is that grid integration costs are not exclusive to variable renewables. All aspects of the system create costs for other parts of the system. So there is a variability in the case of demand, which can't be perfectly forecast. That has a balancing cost. There are transmission costs associated with thermal assets if you have to bring coal from the pit head to the power plant. That has a cost for the rest of the system. So we are not saying that variable renewables are the only ones that introduce these system costs or these grid integration costs, but because of their variability, because of their non-dispatchability, it is important to understand what additional costs they create in the system. So now a brief discussion of the modeling approach that we take. So we run a detailed electricity system optimization model, which runs for every hour of the year. So each simulation simulates 8,760 consecutive hours for the calendar year. The model co-optimizes investment in new capacities necessary to meet demand growth and in power system operation across the full year in order to meet the hourly demand at lowest total system cost. We input to the model assumptions on demand and technology costs that are consistent with the short-term evolution of the power system. So roughly 2025 to 2030. I say roughly because we have multiple scenarios for demand growth. And so you could also think of a high demand scenario as being slightly longer term or low demand scenario slightly shorter term. But technology costs, for example, are calibrated to the year 2025. The model has a full representation of the sunk costs of existing assets. And this means that the model needs to pay the capacity value of all existing assets, coal, gas, hydro, regardless of whether the model finds it optimal to dispatch all the available energy from these assets. And this is important because it means that we are fully capturing the cost of running these assets at lower output in order to maximize the output from VRE. So we often hear in the current discussion, thermal capacity utilization factors are low because demand is low, and that has a cost, a fixed cost for the discoms. So we fully capture this aspect because we make the model pay the sunk costs of all existing assets. The model also has to pay, obviously, the sunk costs of new assets that it builds. By sunk costs, I mean investment cost, so capital cost. We give the model numerous options for investing in new technologies to meet demand. So new coal, new gas, hydro, wind, solar, pumped hydro, battery electric storage. The model can select from whatever combination it wants of these to meet the demand growth that can't be met from the existing assets in the system. The key output is the levelized system cost of generating, including variable costs and fixed costs of existing and new build assets. So with this model, we study some 40 scenarios where we vary assumptions on demand, on the supply options that the model has available for investment in, on the retirement of assets that are reaching the end of their technical lifetime, on the costs of capital, on the availability of pumped hydro, on the costs of battery storage, and so on. So we have tried to capture as many sensitivities as possible and come up with conclusions that are robust to those sensitivities. So I'll now present in just 6 key messages the results of the study. There's lots more detail there that is available for reading once the study is online after the webinar, but in order to keep time for the discussion, I'll be quite brief with the way that I present the key results. So the first key insight is that variable renewable penetrations of wind and solar substantially above today's level are optimal from a cost perspective. So on this graph, we show the results of some 13 of our scenarios. On the x-axis, you have the scenario name. On the y-axis, on the left-hand side, you have the total levelized system cost. This is the total cost to the system for all generation that is required throughout the year. It includes all fixed assets, existing and new build in blue, and the variable costs of all dispatched assets across the year. On the right-hand side, we have the wind and solar share in total generation, and that is represented by the black line with the dots for each scenario. So you can see that the black line essentially for almost all scenarios is somewhere between 38% variable renewables in total generation and somewhat higher, 43, 44%. There are 2 scenarios, high RE and low RE, where we exogenously constrain the model to build either renewables above the optimal level or renewables below the optimal level. Those are the points where the wind and solar share is either substantially higher or substantially lower. So what you can see is that in all of these scenarios, the model finds it optimal to build large amounts of renewables capacity and to maximize as far as possible the share of renewables in total generation. You will also see that the total system cost doesn't actually differ too much between scenarios. And I'll now go on a little bit more to explain why this is happening. So on this graph, we see the same structure as the previous graph. On the left-hand vertical axis, we have the total system cost on a rupees per megawatt hour basis, and we split it between fixed and variable costs. On the right-hand side, you have the wind and solar share in total generation. On the x-axis, we have another group of scenarios that we run where we force the model to build progressively larger and larger amounts of variable renewable capacity, wind and solar. We start with 0 of both, and we end up with sufficient capacity such that the wind and solar share is above 50%. And then we let the model calculate the total system cost for each of these scenarios, breaking it down into fixed and variable share. What you can see is that as we increase the share of variable renewables, total system costs actually fall marginally. And the reason that they fall is that the model is dispatching less and less expensive capacity with high variable costs as the share of variable renewables grow. So the model is making savings on the dispatch of high marginal cost dispatchable coal and gas units. On the other hand, as you drive up the share of variable renewables, the total fixed costs of the system on a per unit base rise. And this is because you're building lots of renewables which have only an investment cost, and therefore you're adding fixed costs to the system. But it's also because you're pushing down the utilization factor of the existing assets and therefore driving up their per unit costs. So the key dynamic that determines the optimal level of renewables in the short term is where this opportunity for arbitrage between high variable cost units to reduce the total variable costs faced by the system and the cost increase in fixed costs, in per unit fixed costs, as you raise the share of renewables, where this arbitrage ends. And so you can see that the total system costs keep declining until the share of renewables reaches roughly 40%, and then slowly start to rise again, because what is happening here is that the cost increase on fixed costs starts to overwhelm the cost decrease on variable costs that you can raise, that you can get by increasing the share of variable renewables. And it is this dynamic, this substitution of essentially expensive energy from high variable cost units for cheap energy from variable renewables, and the increasing capacity cost of the rest of the system as the fixed costs rise, that determines the optimal level of RE in the short term. And what we show is that this sits at about 40% of total generation in the short term. Now, it's also interesting to study the results in terms of what the model builds in terms of new capacities in order to meet demand growth. So here we have the same scenarios on the x-axis, but this time on the y-axis we have the capacities that the model builds in order to meet demand growth. So in purple and orange are wind and solar respectively, red is new gas, and green is pumped hydro. What we see, I've already talked about the growth of renewables, so I will not talk about them here, but what we see is that the model finds it necessary to build some form of a seasonal balancing option, either gas or pumped hydro, or more integration across the borders of Indian states to allow the model to take power from other states at times of the year when variable renewables are not available. So if you look at the arrows, this shows the results for what we call the high market purchase scenario. So when there is a lot of energy that can be purchased in the interstate electricity market. The model finds it doesn't need to build any new coal or new gas or substantial amounts of pumped hydro, because it can meet this seasonal balancing requirement for the couple of weeks of the year where renewables are not available and demand is high, with purchases from the market. On the other hand, if we don't assume any constraints on the amount of pumped hydro that the model can build, this is the pumped hydro, this is the second arrow, pumped hydro scenario. The model also builds out a lot of pumped hydro because it's a very attractive technology for providing this seasonal balancing role. So what we see is that the model needs some option for providing seasonal balancing during the couple of weeks of, say, winter, when the wind is not blowing and neither batteries nor solar are able to meet longer periods of demand that can't be met from renewables. And the most cost optimal option for this seasonal balancing is, first of all, market integration across India, because it allows us to optimize the utilization of assets across the country. Secondly, pumped hydro up to the maximum that can be available. And we know that pumped hydro is constrained by project build out times as well as available capacities. So pumped hydro up to the maximum that can be available. And if absolutely necessary, some new gas. New gas is preferred over coal because its capacity cost is lower. So even though the energy cost of new gas is higher, because you're only using it infrequently throughout the year, the model prefers to take a technology that has a low capacity cost. And I will speak a little bit more about that on a following slide. Key insight number 4, storage is a very attractive technology, and the model picks up on it in all scenarios. So what you can see here in the slide is first of all, on the x-axis, each of our scenario names here, and then on the top panel, the amount of energy capacity of battery electric storage that the model builds out in megawatt hours. In the middle panel, the power capacity in megawatt that the model builds out, and then on the bottom, the energy to power ratio. So this is the amount of hours that the battery electric storage could give you if it is discharging at full power capacity. So what we see is that in the baseline scenario, for example, where we let the model optimize everything by itself and we don't adjust any of our assumptions, the model finds it optimal to build out almost 2,500 megawatt hour of energy capacity, almost 1,000 megawatts of power capacity, and storage duration of slightly above 2 hours. On the other hand, if we force the model to build out lots of RE, this is the high RE scenario that you can see third from the left, the model suddenly finds that it's optimal to build out lots more storage. And this is essentially because the high RE injections, particularly of solar, are forcing into the system a lot of daily variability that battery is perfectly placed to counterbalance. And the reason that batteries are so well suited here is that batteries are essentially only an investment cost. You have to invest in both the power and the energy component of the battery facility. It's only a capital cost. And that means that in order to get a low delivered cost of energy from the battery facilities, you need to operate them very frequently, essentially every day of the year, if possible. And because solar introduces this kind of daily variability, the more solar you have, the more optimal it is to have lots of batteries, because you're operating them every day of the year. And this is also the reason that batteries are not viable to meet the seasonal balancing that I spoke about, integration, or economically met from batteries. If you had to build out batteries just to meet a few weeks of the year, it would be extremely expensive to do so because they're such a capital intensive technology. So the key finding that we find from the model is that battery is a very attractive technology, but it can play at current costs only part of the balancing role. It's great for daily balancing, but it's too capital intensive for seasonal balancing. On the other hand, we also ask the question, what happens if we continue to innovate in battery technologies and the cost of batteries start to drop? So on this graph, we show the same. New wind is in purple, new solar is in orange, gas in red, and pumped hydro in green. Only here we vary the investment cost of batteries. We start at $200 per kilowatt hour, which is slightly above the level of today. And we go down as far as $20 per kilowatt hour. And to be clear, no one is suggesting that lithium-ion battery storage would be available anytime in the foreseeable future at $20 per kilowatt hour. But potentially other seasonal storage technologies could be in the foreseeable almost certain to be optimal to substantially reduce the amount of new gas that it builds, because it is now possible to meet more of this seasonal balancing from batteries. And the model finds it optimal to substantially increase the amount of solar that it builds above the baseline level. So this suggests that the narrative that we have, that by 2030, solar plus batteries will become so economic that they will start to substitute other technologies that we used to provide, for example, seasonal balancing, is something that the model certainly finds. And this gives us some level of confidence that after 2030, we can meet most of incremental demand from renewables plus different types of energy storage. The last point that I wanted to make is summarized in the key message above, and I think I can't put it better than that, so I'll read out that message, which is, as VRE grows, it shapes the economics of the power system, rendering some options economically unfavorable. And what we show here with the arrow is the capacity build out in the low RE scenario, where we exogenously constrain the model to build out less renewables than it finds to be cost optimal. And what you can see is that this is the only scenario, except for a scenario in which we don't allow the model to invest in new gas, in which the model builds out new coal. And the reason it builds out new coal in this scenario is that because there are less renewables in this scenario, there is more of demand available for the new coal units, and therefore their CUF is higher. And that allows coal to be an attractive technology. Coal is a much higher capital intensity technology than say gas, and so it needs to run at a higher utilization rate to be economic. But the problem is, if you constrain the amount of variable renewables you can build, you don't get all the benefits to the system costs of the cheap energy value of renewables. And so essentially what the model is telling us is there is a trade-off. If you want cheap energy value from renewables, you need to stop investing in high capital intensity technologies like coal, because there is less of demand available to them, so that they are now uneconomic. And so essentially what we are seeing is that as renewables grow, they shape the economics of the power system. The power system starts to need low capital intensity technologies like pumped hydro, or to optimize the utilization of existing sunk capital assets through the grid integration across the borders of Indian states, or to build out pumped hydro, which as long as you can get brownfield pumped hydro, is a low capital intensity technology. And so this is a dynamic that we expect to become more and more dominant as renewables continue to increase their share in total generation. They will shape the economics of the power system, and other options become either more viable or less viable because of this effect that renewables are creating. So key conclusions summarized in 3 points. VRE penetration substantially above today's levels are economic. And other studies have shown that the kind of penetrations that I've talked about in this presentation are not a problem from a technical perspective, provided we do our work of flexibilization of the power system well. The key dynamic that allows VRE penetrations to be substantially higher above today's level and still have lower system costs is this substitution between variable costs and fixed costs. Essentially, we need to think of the economics of a high renewable system as cheap energy plus expensive capacity, because that capacity must be available to generate when renewables are not available. And as long as this equation of cheap energy plus expensive capacity is balanced correctly, then it is perfectly possible for the total system costs to be substantially lower, or for us to be able to drive up the share of renewables to such a degree that total system costs are not above today's level. Second point is VRE usage shapes the rest of the power system's economics. I will not dwell on that anymore. Third point, because the net equation of this cheap energy plus expensive capacity is likely to be beneficial for renewables in the short term, not about costs to the system because they are likely to be negligible, but how to maximize the gross benefits of VRE and minimize and allocate the gross costs. So with that, I'll close the presentation, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much. And Sonali, I think you can unshare my screen.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for making the presentation. I'd like to share that the report is now available on the website, and we'll be sharing the link to access it on the chat box shortly. I would now like to invite Mr. A.K. Saxena, Senior Director, TERI, to chair the panel discussion. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Ravni. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So I think we are having a very, very distinguished panel today, and we are very thankful to all of them for joining and making it convenient to share their impressions. I'll start the panel discussion by saying that there can be no two opinions about pursuing in the right interest the ambitious targets the country had set for the renewable energy from energy security and sustainable development point of view. Significant decline in the tariffs of variable renewable energy sources is certainly a good news. Coupled with different forms of storage to deliver dispatchable energy, as discovered in the bids during the last 1 year or so, at tariffs competitive with coal, augurs well for addressing the challenges of meeting the demand from our resources when the sun is not shining or the wind is not blowing. Assessment of grid integration costs of the variable renewable energy nevertheless remains extremely important, especially from the perspective of distribution companies in the country. In order to assess the grid integration cost from systems point of view, it is extremely important to look at them holistically and develop and refine a framework for capturing various nuances which are there. This would help the DISCOMs, the policymakers, as well as the regulators at the state and central level to see these implications in a better light and facilitate decision making. The study carried out by TERI and presented by my colleague Thomas Spencer is a step in this direction. Now I would like to request the panelists one by one to be sharing their impressions. And we have the good fortune of having a system operator, a modeler, and a policy perspective professional. First of all, I would like to request Mr. Narasimhan to share his views. Before I invite Mr. Narasimhan to give his thoughts, I would like to mention that Mr. Narasimhan is currently Executive Director System Operation in the OSOCO. He has over 3 decades of experience in the power system operation spread across Central Electricity Authority, Power Grid Corporation of India Limited, and OSOCO. He has been deeply involved in various studies, starting from the Greening the Grid study, which was the first study to look at the possibility of integrating 175 gigawatt renewable to the grid. And he has also had a close look at all other studies, such as the optimal generation mix by the CEA and the study carried out by us in TERI. Mr. Narasimhan, may I now request you to share your thoughts and impressions about this study framework, results and suggestions for building this further from the operations perspective. Over to you, Mr. Narasimhan.
Yeah, namaskar. Thank you, Mr. A.K. Saxena ji. At the outset, I would like to thank the TERI team for having me on board as a panelist And at the outset, my congratulations to Mr. Thomas Spencer and the entire team for working on such an excellent report, which is incidentally the first of its kind that I have come across. And because actually this interplay between fixed charges and variable charges, that's something which is quite unique, though intuitively many of us understand, but this is the first report which has captured this essence. And ever since I started my career in power system, this interplay between fixed charges and variable charges has always fascinated most of us. And even when the first set of super thermal power stations were commissioned way back in the early 80s by NTPC, we had the philosophy of a merry-go-round system, for handling coal transport. And the merry-go-round system essentially it increased the fixed costs but reduce the variable cost. So we had a situation of two similar power stations, one with MGR and one without MGR, and you found that fixed charge and variable charge was that interplay you could observe. And then moving on, when the Central Electricity Regulatory Commission was established, we had secondary fuel oil consumption. That was essentially, we had a flip-flop of sorts. Earlier, it was part of the variable charge. Then it moved to the fixed cost for a certain 5 years. And then now again, it's back to variable cost. So that interplay also is there. And on the transmission side, most of us understand that it's essentially fixed cost. But yes, there is a transmission losses component which is variable, and we have kept it simple since losses are to be paid in kind. So we have not captured that part. So transmission essentially remains fixed cost for us today. But yes, if you are considering storage as a transmission asset, then the division line gets blurred. So leaving aside, this was just a detour, on the fixed charge and variable charge. Leaving aside this interplay, uh, the report, it's really an excellent one, particularly as it is looking at the state level simulations. That's, we generally have many simulations done at the all India level, which generally simplifies the whole thing. But it is, these studies are actually required at the state level, where the actual portfolio management is taking place. And that's where this study is important, because it has captured, taken an example of Maharashtra, but it could be any other state. Why I say this state level studies are important, because different states are at different levels of RE penetration. If you take Maharashtra, it is in the 5 to 10% range of renewable energy penetration. Similarly, if you take many states like Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, or Rajasthan, they would be in the 10 to 20% bracket. But if you look at some of the other states, like southern region states like Andhra Pradesh and Karnataka, they are in the 20 to 30% bracket of wind and solar energy penetration. So obviously, the studies need to be done, the simulations, they would be different. What approach each state has to take would depend essentially on this mix that is there. And only one comfort which this study gives is that anyone who is today at the 0 to 10% or the 10 to 20% bracket, there's absolutely no problem in going up to 25 to 30%, even if we discount about 5 to 10% for certain things like unit commitment, which has not been factored in the studies, just to keep it simple. So the point is, we have on the one instance, SECI having a situation of that states are not willing to sign PPAs, but at least those states which are in the 0 to 10, 5 to 10% and 10 to 20% bracket, they need not, they must go ahead and aggressively sign these PPAs. That is one lesson which I would take from this study. And definitely states like southern region, they are, which are at 20 to 30%, they seriously now need to look at storage if they wish to integrate more wind and solar into their system. And then transmission, of course, that's going to be a great leveler. So this has to be seen in the context of countrywide uniform RPO targets that is there. I think with transmission, that's achievable, but again, one would need to study for each state and see. So that's on the study, this report part. I would only say that DISCOM level involvement in such studies is urgently required, besides an implementation plan for implementing the study outcomes. And it's also good to see that open source platforms like PIPESA, that's been used. And we have been seeing an increasing number of open source software like GridPath we had recently by Prayas, Balmoral, there's some initiative on the Denmark side, and we had the READS platform from NREL. So it's a good sign that we have more and more of this open source software, but then that also brings into question the need for a common information model, for data exchange between these platforms. That would make, different people can work on the same model, but generally to give confidence, if there is portability between different software, that would be great. So I'll stop here at this stage, and thank you. Hand it over to Mr. Saxena.
Thank you, Mr. Narasimhan, for giving your various insights in regard to the interplay between the fixed cost and the variable cost, and the transmission being a great leveler, and the states which are already having high degree of RE penetration, they have to start looking at the storage as an option and start preparing for that. I think we will come back to you after we get the questions from the audience, the invitees. And thank you so much, Mr. Narasimhan. Now we have Dr. Puneet Chitkara, a very well-known modeler, professional, a colleague with whom I have interacted very closely. I had a privilege of having across the table discussion, which is very rare in the current day world, across the table discussion. And I think I was knowing that he has gone for higher studies, his postdoctoral studies at the Johns Hopkins University. Until a few days ago, I was not aware that he has come back. So very warm welcome back to Dr. Puneet Chitkara, very warm welcome. I think Dr. Chitkara is currently Executive Director, Data Sciences, Infrastructure, Government and Healthcare at KPMG. He has worked at various types of models, and he has guided his team in regard to various models. He has done extensive work at the state level, and he has got very deep insights at the state level systems. Dr. Chitkara, as you are aware that the models which we can have could be the operations model or capacity expansion model, or it could be a combination of both. And the operations model which one can develop or configure would also vary depending on the level of information and depth we can go into, number one. And number two, the granularity with which we look at, whether it is an hourly dispatch model or a sub-hourly dispatch model, the implications and the results would be totally different. You are well aware of that, and we would very earnestly request you to bring your impression when you deal with your impressions. I think we will request you to touch upon these. Secondly, I would also like to request you to give your thoughts in regard to the treatment of transmission cost. Transmission cost, as we know, the sharing of transmission system charges in India, you are very well aware. You were very involved in the development of POC charges from the very beginning, and you have deep insights in regard to this. So with these broad macro level points, which I thought you could cover along with your impression, that would be greatly useful to all of us. Over to you, Dr. Puneet Chitkara.
Thank you very much, sir. And thank you very much, TERI, for inviting me. On the first aspect, yes, I mean, definitely. And the more granular you go, you get some more insights, especially we looked at first the greening the grid report that was done at an all India level by Anil, and later on the report by TERI. Now, one reality that we see is that, for example, one of the southern Indian state SLDCs regularly puts up on their website they have planned curtailment in the range of 10 to 25%. Planned curtailment. So there is one kind of curtailment that happens on a real-time basis. You take decisions and you have to curtail. But there is some curtailment that seems to be happening on a planned basis. Now, when you see that happening, one needs to kind of understand the reasons for that. And this is actually important, because if you do only pure technical studies, like studies which have, say, you would have the best of unit commitment models with 5-minute time intervals, and you could see to some extent some kind of curtailment happening because of the paucity of the flexibility system. However, there also the complete curtailment we may not be able to capture, essentially because of the way the system operations are arranged in India. But what I mean by this is that, in fact, I learned a lot from a book written by Professor Navroz Dubash, where he says that there are these political and institutional considerations that come into the dispatch decisions. Now, when you kind of build in those kind of considerations along with these technical traits that are there in the model, then you find that certain kind of then you find that some curtailment starts coming up there. Why is it important to capture this? Is because the ultimate objective of all this greening the grid and renewable energy capacities coming in, is that finally we want to increase the mix in energy. We want to increase the renewable energy mix. And if we find that these are being hampered by certain institutional and political factors, and you can actually see and quantify them, then I think it is that aspect that needs a focus rather than creating capacities. Because capacity, so any state, a state like Karnataka, state like Tamil Nadu, can go on and create say storage capacities, can create pump storage capacities, and so on and so forth, and create all the balancing that's required within the state. But you know that despite transmission capacity being available, interstate transmission capacity being available, why does Telangana and Andhra Pradesh, the strength capacity is there, the hydro capacity is there, not stand up for the variability in the state of Tamil Nadu? Probably the kind of incentives and institutional mechanisms need to be worked on there. And it is possible, as I'm just repeating myself, it is possible to kind of bring in a modeling framework such factors beyond just looking at making the models more technically robust in terms of kind of unit commitment and stuff like that. And actually, when I say this with some kind of confidence, because recently in my postdoctoral fellow at Hopkins, I did this kind of thing on an all India level. We incorporated, there is this study done by ICEP at the Johns Hopkins University, where we actually building these kind of institutional constraints in pure play technical models and all India level, and we saw that there are these institutional reasons which play a big role in kind of causing curtailment and increasing the costs by as much as 27 to 28%. And I'm talking only about the variable costs. Then on the second aspect of the transmission charges that you mentioned, sir. Here, transmission charges, the transmission charges and losses allocation mechanism, they should not kind of change my least cost dispatch. They should not change my merit order. And the way the losses are allocated as per the latest regulations, we see, and I discussed this with you, sir, that they actually change my merit order. And therefore, in this context, it is good that this study by TERI does not explicitly capture the transmission costs. This study in fact shows that what would be the result of a pure play least cost system operation, and transmission charges are fixed charges which can be imposed on top of this, which have to be paid by the grid connected entities, and they should be levied in a manner that they should not change the results of the models like the one that has been done by TERI. So from that perspective, I think the transmission charges being fixed charges, they should be levied outside, completely outside of this, and with no kind of a link with the energy component, because the moment you do that, you in fact get into the problem of disturbing the merit order dispatch. In fact, the PIPSA kind of frameworks and similar frameworks like switch model and other open source models that are there, they allow for congestion in the network, and you can see that some kind of congestion revenue is being generated from this, which can probably fund maybe a small, but that small part of transmission charges. So a part of that, part of the transmission charges is coming from here. The rest of it can come as a fixed charge from, and that fixed charge, how that is allocated between states, can be determined based on various other mechanisms. I mean, you could go in for any of those mechanisms. I would not want to show my predilection towards the POC mechanism here, but yes, I mean, you could actually adopt any mechanism that you want for allocation of the remaining charges.
Thank you, Dr. Puneet. I think so nice of you to have given your thoughts very clearly in regard to the reasons beyond the technical reasons which come into play while dispatching the generating units at the state level. And that's an extremely important practical reality. And I think you have laid the foundation for the impressions to be given by Professor Navroz Dubash, and you have given a link to the study or the work which he has done in regard to the policy and institutional considerations which go into this aspect. Very warm welcome to you, Professor Navroz. I think very thankful to you for sparing time on this for this event. Colleagues, Professor Navroz Dubash needs no introduction to this audience or any other audience. He is so well known that I would not go into much of the reading his CV, but suffice it would be to say that he is actively engaged in climate debate. He was instrumental in establishing Global Climate Action Network in 1990 and has written widely about the climate politics, policy and governance. He has authored 2 books, edited 10 and co-edited books for special issues and journals, a number of them. I think if I start reading, I will take a good amount of time. But with this, I think what I would like to request you, Professor Navroz, is that you have seen the type of modeling, this study which our team has done. Some of the things we have taken as part of the model. Some of the things which we thought are rather to be treated outside the model as to be done. Beyond this, we have kept it aside as of now, and we are very happy to note that Dr. Puneet Chitkara and as well as Mr. Narasim also gave certain impressions which find it to be in the right direction. We are happy to note that, but this is a subject matter of discussion. We will continue to discuss and refine this, but I would like to request you to give your impressions from this study and the larger perspective in regard to the political and institutional considerations, which are extremely important when we go to the state level work. I think we are all well aware that the studies at the national level have been done and enough of insights have been drawn. The penetration right now is 10%, and the greening the grid study established that even 22% of penetration is not a problem to integrate. The marginal curtailment in certain scenarios, one can integrate that large amount of renewables, and the CA study for 2030 or study for 3030 also brings out a number of inventions. So I think with this background and backdrop, over to you, Professor Navroz Dibash. All ears to you.
Thank you very much for your generous introduction, Mrs. Saxena, and thanks to Dr. Mathur, to Thomas, and to Sri Narasimhans and Dr. Chitkara who preceded me. I've learned a lot from listening to all of you. In some ways, I feel like this is a territory that I'm really much more of a learning mode, and I've learned from all of you already over the years and today as well. I realize also we are running short of time, and I'm sure it'd be good to get the audience in. So I'll be quite brief in making a few points. I think one of the clear messages of this study that is extremely important at the moment and builds on all the studies that Mr. Saxena mentioned earlier, all the ones that have preceded it, is to say that there is actually substantial headroom here on variable renewable energy. So a lot of the discussions and debates about whether or not the quite heavy emphasis on capacity expansion and all the issues around that, whether or not the capacity expansion is being done in a way where the bidding is too aggressive and so on, are all salient debates. But this integration question is for the time being should not be the basis on which we should be wary about the capacity expansion. The system certainly has headroom to absorb this. But the interesting question is absorb it in what specific ways? And I think Mr. Chitkara particularly pointed to the fact that it is not just a technical question; it is also the political and institutional one. And so I think that you are right at TERI to think that the next step has to be to look at more state-specific issues. And one of the things that, and I'm grateful to Dr. Chitkara for mentioning our earlier study on this, one example of the sorts of factors that are important there are, for example, states may just wish to control more electricity sources in their own hands for various political reasons. So, for example, this is a parallel debate about shutting down old coal-fired power plants on an accelerated schedule for air pollution reasons, and et cetera, et cetera. And one of the political reasons that may not happen is simply because states like having state-owned coal capacity, even if it is old and inefficient, that is theirs to run in a manner that is more controllable. That has proved to be a problem, and I suspect it will continue to be an issue going forward. So that's sort of one of the friction points. One of the results of the study is, as some of these are, they reinforce things we already know. Grid integration is a very big part of bringing down some of these integration costs, and so that continues to be an area for us to be thinking about. Let me just see. So another point with regard to the states is that we are currently in a moment where, if I might be a bit sort of direct about this, the governance of the power sector is increasingly being centralized. So just recently, in the budget, there was a proposal to essentially create an incentive structure. I think it was 3 lakh crores that was put forward over 5 years, subject to a set of disciplines that would be enforced by the states, by the center over the state. Now, we all agree that the states, that there is a role for some disciplining of the states, but at the same time, we also know that the states take the decisions that they do because they face various political and electoral compulsions and so on and so forth. So how do we change that in a fundamental way? And I think we will find out over the next few years whether or not the center is in a position to shift those incentives just by withholding, by pulling the levers that they have at their control. So this is an interesting context for what is coming out quite clearly as a lot of state specificity. So for example, the study talks about the difference between high variable cost systems and low variable cost and high coal systems versus low coal systems and so on. So to what extent do states need flexibility to deal with these different contexts as we go forward in this transition? So are we in a sense moving to a more centralized system at a time when, to make this transition most effective, states need to have more direct control? It's a question that I think we have to explore and think about a little bit more. So I think a big set of issues is around the states and the practicalities of how states engage in the sector. I was also struck by some of the comments on battery systems. So I think the report makes clear that at some point we will need battery electricity storage systems. That's not, again, a surprise to anybody, but it also seems to suggest that that moment is not immediate, that we can go a long way before doing that. So simultaneously, the idea of, so that then has important implications for how India thinks about its innovation story and its manufacturing story with regard to batteries. So perhaps we actually can think about this in a phased way, where we wait for the cost to come down a bit more and think about whether we can build ourselves an industrial structure to manufacture batteries. If it is not something that is tearingly urgent in the short run, but something that we can plan for over a few years, then this kind of study even informs that thinking about not just the electricity system and the transition, but what it means for India's larger term plans to become a hub for low carbon low carbon manufacturing technologies such as battery technologies. I think the final point that I would make in just and then I look forward to the questions, is that this is a very important piece of a larger story. The understanding the cost of VRE is a very important piece of a larger story about electricity transition more generally. And I also wonder whether these isolated conversations that we are having, they're big conversations, but they're isolated in the sense that this is a technical conversation about VRE. Somewhere else there's a conversation about shutdown of coal-fired power plants. Somewhere else there's a conversation about manufacturing of solar. Where is the place that we are trying to put all these pieces together? I think the best place right now where they are being put together is in fact TERI, because all of these questions are being asked in individual ways in TERI. But as a country as a whole, are we asking this question about this broader transition and its implications in a way that allows us to draw on all these bits of analysis and make sensible decisions? And I think we're just starting with that process. But this report and its importance and its success at answering a focused question makes me then wonder how we start putting all the pieces together, who does that, and how we do it in a way that builds over time to helping with this energy transition. So I just sort of want to leave it at that slightly bigger level point as well. Thank you, Dr. Saxena.
Thank you, Professor Navroz Dubash. I think I see Dr. Mathur wanting to give certain impressions.
Yeah, Naroz, quick question. I'm not going to let you get away that easily. So I completely accept that this can only be one starting point for a discussion. But what the components of the discussion should be, who are the people who should be at the table, what other kinds of analysis are needed, are things that I believe all of us, as part of the electricity community in this country, need to push. can I ask you to share your thoughts? I mean, I completely agree. I'm taking you by surprise. It's maybe something you've not thought about. But I think it will be important if you have any ideas, it will be useful on how we carry this further.
Just to understand, Dr. Mathur, so how we have the conversation that allows us to sort of join the dots, as it were. Is that the question?
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah. Well, you know, in a climate context, which is not same by any means, but it's related, I've been asking a similar set of questions, and my own sense is that we have the benefit of having relatively well-structured ministerial governance structures, right? So Ministry of Power, Ministry of Environment, and so on and so forth. But the cross-pollination across them at the moment is not happening. The place that those things happen is, you know, it used to happen somewhat in the Planning Commission. Arguably, the specialist capacity is a bit less in Niti Aayog, so it happens perhaps even less than it did there earlier. On occasion, the PMO for high-profile issues comes in and sort of forces some discussion. I sort of feel like we perhaps could usefully move to a system where we have some kind of advisory structures that bring together in a more deliberative way, not a decision-making way, but a deliberative way, advisory structures of people within and outside government, and build those processes into something more like a white paper format. So before we make decisions, this advisory group could actually generate a white paper that then gets discussed in Parliament. It gets discussed in other places. It's a long, drawn-out process, but then these are complicated issues. And I think you know, having some regular mechanism like that for generating information, credible information, and then having a mechanism to have broader discussion over it. So that when the time comes where we are pushed to make a decision, there is sort of already a community of people and an information base. So that's a slightly different way of thinking about it than we currently make decisions.
So I'll carry this further later on offline. Don't want to hog the time, but I think, you know, in the current government setup, we have long, you know, for 50 years have lost the idea of white papers. So maybe one of the things we could do is enable several of us, a much broader stakeholder group, to get together and write a white paper, including the government ministries in their personal capacities, not their official capacities. And the key issue would be then to put it out for debate. And at some point, I hope, and this is opportunistic, some ministry then takes ownership of it, or the regulatory commission, or somebody takes ownership of it, recognizes it, and runs with it. Saxena Saab, all yours. Sorry.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Professor Navroz. I think we take note of the very important point what you have given, and the interplay between various factors at the state level and the center versus state control, and the desire to be having sort of a say in the decision making to a larger extent. All those are very, very important issues. And I think you have made a very important case for the coordinated approach to move forward, and looking at not only the electricity sector or the industry sector, but all sectors put together, and various forms of electricity and the manufacturing capability in the country. I think thank you so much, and we will, I think the thought which Dr. Mathur gave, and you answered to it, and it's a thought and a point to be taken forward, and in order to bring this debate and discussion in regard to this theme of energy transition in the country onto the rightful path, and in a bid to arrive at the right decisions in the right time frame. I think it is extremely important, and I think this will do a lot of good. And I think we take note of this, and we will see how we at TERI can take it forward and try to facilitate something, whatever best we could do. As all of you might be aware that in TERI, we have been working at the electricity transition, industry transition, and a number of themes for the last 2 years or so. And quite a few reports have been brought in, and they are all leading to the right direction. And I think we feel that now the right amount of awareness and appreciation is already there. And I think it is only trying to be precipitate them and lead to the rightful actions that are what is there. But then, yes, it is a long drawn journey. It is not only a technical decisions which are to be there. This is not only a financial decisions which are to be there. There are communities involved, and I think we are all well aware of the notion of just transition, or the concept of just transition. We have to see that we work in a manner which is just for all those who are going to be affected by this. And you would be happy to know that we at TERI have also done a case study on the just transition in one of the mines which saw natural exhaustion in the state of Madhya Pradesh in the Betul district, and that has given us meaningful impressions about this. So thank you so much to all the panelists in regard to whatever the important points which they brought out and the learning which we can take. A lot of good points which we could pick up about what more can be done and how to factor in what we have not factored in so far and how we move forward. They're all very well with us. Now, may I request Avni to let us know, are there any questions, important questions, which we could take one or two questions from the panelists in general or to any specific panelist?
Yes, sir. I'm going to share the questions. So the one question is slide on the presentation. Slide 10 shows investments in gas-based technology. The present gas-based capacity is not being utilized fully at present. If new gas-based capacity is built further, whether they will be utilized, the question is whether they will be utilized.
May I request my colleague Thomas is there? I think Thomas, would you like to answer this? If Thomas is not there, I think I would like to say that yes, it is a very important point. But then I think the emerging scenario demands that this is a requirement for the seasonal balancing, and it, of course, it is subject to the availability of gas and at the prices which are affordable to the end consumer. I would like to say that I think this is essential.
Yeah, can I just come in? I think.
Yeah, Mr. Narasimhan.
Yeah, I think the assumption is clearly stated in the report. It says that in the baseline scenario, the marginal cost of new gas is 3.5 rupees a kilowatt hour, and in the high scenario, this increases to 4 rupees per kilowatt hour. So I think that would explain. The moment you increase this, then gas doesn't get selected.
Yeah, that's one. And I think the other important question would be the availability of gas.
The gas is available, but at a price, like if it is $8 per
availability at that price.
And this is the variable.
Any other question, Avni?
So the next question is, what is the demand for electricity, and the study is for which year? What is the capacity mix in each scenario, as that will also determine the cost of balancing?
The study is for the year 2030, and this is for a state, and the study results which are presented are for the state of Maharashtra. And I think I don't have the demand numbers readily, but then I think anybody is there from the team, he could provide. Otherwise, we will let the colleague know that what are the demand numbers for the state of Maharashtra which have been considered. I think what I remember in the baseline scenario from the last demand figure, I think there's a 37% increase in the baseline scenario over the demand of 2019. And in the low demand scenario, it is 27% increase. And in the high demand scenario, it is 47% increase. So I think this is what are the three scenarios which are built for the state of Maharashtra from the last available figure, the annual figure.
Thank you, sir.
Yes,
so these were the two questions which had come in.
So I think with this, I think I would say that I would like to thank all the panelists and all the attendees who have been here with us for about 1.5 hours. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for letting us know that this is a step in the right direction, and a lot more spice and needs to be added into this. A lot more work has to be done, and this is a framework, and or a template which we could call it. And I think the idea is to do this study for various states with various kinds of demand profiles and the generation supply mix in order to arrive at meaningful conclusions for various states and give them the confidence and comfort that what is the level of RE penetration which they can accommodate into their portfolio without much of additional financial burden, and what they need to start looking at, what does the future is likely to unfold for them, and what should they start preparing in next few years. That is what is the aim of our work, and we will keep on developing further, and we will involve and associate with all of you after we have done some other work in this direction, and we would look forward to your valuable feedback and suggestions, and we'll move forward accordingly. Thank you so much to all of you. Thank you, Dr. Mathur, Professor Navroz, Dr. Puneet, Mr. Narasimhan. Thank you so much. And thank you, Avni, for conducting the event.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very, very much.